Hi, I'm John Grooters. It's rare to find the one person who is writer, producer, director, and even actor. To pull that off takes talent. And to pull it off well takes drive and commitment. Today's guest does it all. Meet Cristobal Krusen on No Shame.
Have no shame, no, we are not afraid, no shame of the gospel of his name. It's the power of God by which we all are saved. We need not be afraid, no shame.
So my guest today on the No Shame podcast is Mr. Cristobal Krusen, who is a writer and a director. And I have heard the most interesting man in the world. Is this the reputation that you have earned?
I don't often drink beer, but when I do, I prefer Dos Equis.
You see, I knew you were that guy because you have a very interesting life, and you have had a very interesting life. Would you say that's true?
Yeah, I hope you don't mean in the sense of the Chinese curse.
Oh, no, I don't mean that sense. No. I mean multiple countries, great stories, art, the things that you've done.
Yes. No, I have, and I'm very thankful for that. Partly out of my own restlessness and desire, perhaps to live that exciting life, interesting life, and then just through chance, fate, God's will, design, all of that.
Well, it's I've been looking forward to this conversation today, and it's a privilege to talk to you. Not only do I enjoy bringing conversations to podcast listeners, whoever they are and wherever they are, but the sneaky truth of all this is I do this just so I get to meet interesting people and pick their brains. And I know that I could learn a lot from you because in a lot of ways, I've kind of followed your footsteps in some ways, in so much as that I've traveled the world, in producing different kinds of media and films, and I see some of the work that you do, and I see you once in a while at the festivals that we attend. We've been to the Saboth International Film Festival in Milan. We've been to the ICVM film festivals. And I just know how much respect people have for you and for your work. So it's really an honor to have a chance to converse with you today.
Oh, thank you, John.
Plus, we have nothing else to do.
That's right. And it's fun. It's fun to talk and to spend this time with you to get to know you better. I want to say that as well from my perspective.
You know, the work that we both do, and so if you're listening, I said this at the front, but Cristobal is a writer and is a director, which are two jobs that are on my business card too. And because of that, I'm fascinated how other producers and writers and directors approach the craft. And I'm really fascinated when fellow believers approach the craft and still make the work artistic. And I think this man today, his work has been... it's very artistic work that he does. You don't just sort of do preaching on film, I wouldn't say. You are a storyteller and an artist. How would you describe the work that you do?
Yeah, very much so. A storyteller. I looked at your kind of demo reel, if you will, on your website a few days ago, and I noticed how you emphasize story and the idea that even today, in 2020, we as a people, as a race, the human race, we love to gather around the campfire. Not necessarily the literal campfire anymore, but just as people did thousands and thousands of years ago, we love as human beings to gather around a campfire and hear a story. And I'm no different. And from that little child who would hear the stories around the campfire, I guess I've grown up to be one of the tellers of stories around the campfire, though I still love to sit at the campfire too and hear a good story, see a good story. So, yeah, I think it was Clint Eastwood who said story is king. I mean, he certainly wouldn't be alone in having expressed that. It's at the core, of who we are. And then, of course, we look at Jesus and his ministry on earth. He was a storyteller too. He taught the people through parables and through stories.
What is a story? Just, we use that term a lot, but so what's the difference between a story and maybe a didactic speech, maybe a sermon, maybe a teaching? Right. What's the difference between a story and a teaching?
Yeah. Well, when you mentioned teaching and a didactic approach, I just have to sort of backtrack a bit and say I became a follower of Christ at the age of 29. Which, just looking at the number 29, that implies that I had a very different life before coming to accept Christ. And I had gone to secular film schools and was trying to find my way in the secular industry and so forth and so on. But when I became a follower of Christ, I kind of threw everything overboard and said, okay, I'm all in. I don't think I'll ever be a filmmaker, but I'm going to be a missionary. I'm going to preach at people, and I'm going to see souls won to Christ. And I became a very didactic. My approach to sharing the gospel became very didactic, almost unilaterally so. It was just preach the word, preach the word. And what I began to realize was that while that has its appeal and its place and its power, and let me emphasize the word power, being an artist and a storyteller and a filmmaker doesn't usually adopt that approach, the didactic approach. And I've had to sort my way through the weeds, as it were, because I think if I had been brought up in the church, I probably would have worked this out a lot earlier, because I think by gifting and calling, I am an artist, a storyteller, a filmmaker. But I kind of had to, or I didn't have to, but I threw that overboard, as I said, to follow what I considered God's calling, which was to make known the gospel. And it took me several years to figure out that God could also be honored and served and the gospel spread through story. And now I'm at the place where I'm completely unashamed about sharing the gospel through story. And by the way, maybe to more precisely answer your question, story is by definition, it operates with symbols, it operates with nuance. Story is conveyed through subtlety. Story is conveyed through emotion, not necessarily just teaching propositions. And I've always believed, not always, but I've come to understand that before you can preach at a person, or let's just say reach a person intellectually, you must first capture their heart. And so that's what I try to do with my films. I set out first and foremost to engage the viewer's heart, their emotions. Once I've engaged their emotions and they've agreed or given assent to accompanying me on this journey of the story, then I can move on at some point to more propositional truths.
That's a really, that's an amazing point. And I think I often, I think I fall too much on the side of plot. Story is plot. It has to have and there's a part of story that's plot, but what you're talking about emotion and heart is beyond plot, isn't it?
Yes. I think the two, though, do go hand in hand. If the audience feels the plot is preposterous and they don't buy it to begin with, it's kind of a lost cause at that point as well. So plot is obviously important, but if we think of it as a framing device, that's important. It's good. But what are we really after? We want to move people, don't we, emotionally? Mm-hmm. I think it was Frank Capra who said, quote, "I used to think drama was when the actors cried. Now I've come to learn it's when the audience cries." So that kind of gets to the point,
You've said one of the goals of your films, I think I saw this somewhere from you, that is to address the deepest needs of the human heart. And again, that sounds like something a little bit maybe beyond what I would just call entertainment. And I'm not criticizing entertainment. I think that story around the campfire a lot of times was just to keep the mind occupied. And, I imagine if we had had a chance to listen to, Mark Twain make enough story off the top of his head at a campfire in the late 1800s, man, we would have been spellbound as much as a great film would spellbound us today. But Mark Twain didn't have the tools that we have. Man, he would have been a heck of a director, I think. But when you say you're trying to address the deepest needs of the human heart, do you remember saying that? Is that from you?
Yeah, that's from me. That's from me. I guess if we can be just totally frank here, that was perhaps a bit of a coded way of saying, "Hey, I'm a Christian."
Beautiful.
It's what is the heart? Okay, the heart is obviously a physical thing inside our chest, but from ancient times, all civilizations, societies, they've referred to this sort of invisible seat of human emotion, right? And you don't have to be a Christian to know that people have a heart, and we all. I guess you could say that's the part of us that, or certainly a part of us made in the image of God, right? So the seat of the emotions. And another thing that relates to the heart for me is transcendence. That word transcendence, and what I'm trying also to do in my films is present to the viewer, and by the way, the viewer that I most like to reach is a viewer outside the church, frankly. And they're kind of the audience that I really want to reach. That's my desire, my primary desire. But to give them a story, a film that shows glimmers and gives hints of transcendence. There's something beyond the physical here. And of course, I'm coming at it from a Christian worldview, a Christian perspective. But like in the film I made in Bosnia a few years back, I also utilized a Bosnian poet for the narration who is, he's passed away now, but he was Muslim. And he wrote some of the most beautiful poetry that referred to Christ, to Jesus. But he was not a Christian per se, but he had tapped into that transcendence. And there was that beautiful overlap between his spirituality and Christian spirituality. And his poetry gave expression to that transcendence. So that's also really important. That's like I'm no mechanic. I'm terrible with mechanical things. But when you start up a car, there's some sort of thing that sparks it into action, right? Into motion. And so I think the heart of man, the heart of human beings it's there and it's waiting to receive something from beyond this, something divine.
So there's the rub, because making writing poetry or writing a book, you can absolutely talk about transcendent things, and you can describe the most metaphysical reality that you can possibly conclude and put on paper. But in a film, you've got to put it on the screen. And you've got one thing to work with, and that's action. You really can't work with thought very naturally, or inclination, or realization, or the transcendent spirituality. So these things are these invisible things, and yet we go to this very visual medium. And isn't that sort of the challenge of making a film like you make?
Yes, absolutely. And I think you're absolutely right about that. One of the ways that I feel we can sort of solve that conundrum, that obstacle or problem, is through our actors. I'm speaking to you as a director. You and I know that if the actor can succeed in capturing that personality and conveying the reality of that character, that person, that the audience, that's how they're getting their information, right, from that actor. And audience members, I'm of the opinion, they one of the reasons they love going to a movie is they will watch that actor like a hawk, like a little kid, watches grown-ups, for better or worse. But I believe the audience is watching that actor, and they're looking into the actor's eyes, and they're even trying to read the actor's thoughts. I mean, that's one of the things I think audiences love about a movie, is trying to figure out the plot. They don't want to be spoon-fed. They want you to give them clues and pull them in and engage them. But they also want to discover for themselves what's going on. And I think that when an actor does a really good job of portraying a character, the audience is kind of reading in things that are not being spoken, like you said, or spelled out for us, but they are kind of filling in blanks and coming to conclusions.
How do you work with actors? What's your method? Once they've been cast, and that's that's another story, but once they've been cast, how do you like to work with actors?
Well, kind of first among equals, is that the expression? I have such tremendous respect for actors. I like acting myself. So I approach actors with tremendous respect, gratitude. I'm very frank with them and open. I come alongside them. We're friends. We discuss before we shoot. We talk through motive, and we talk through if there's a question they may have, or a doubt they have about something or other, or a suggestion. I take all of that very seriously. And I also treat actors a little bit as children, in the sense that they can be very emotional and unruly, perhaps sometimes, or they need a firm hand as a parent might provide. But more than anything else, I just am inclined to treat actors with tremendous respect. They're kind of the connection for me to the divine. I mean, they're the muse. The actor is the muse.
Well, as a writer, it's really an enjoyable thing to see words that you've written come to life in someone else's dialect and phraseology and a twist of a head and pacing, and you're like, wow, that's a whole different. It's a whole different thing than I heard in my head when I wrote it. But that's how it's. Isn't that fun to watch the actors interpret your words?
Oh, it absolutely is, and wow, it feels like what a privilege, what an honor. Because as you said, you've perhaps created something from nothing in terms of your script. It's a story, and you've organized all these people and equipment, and there's so much money involved in making this thing that really did not exist before. And these actors are really the front line in carrying it forward.
And that money aspect, which is just a flat reality of movie making, can become this real enemy in building the kind of relationship that you're describing. At least I find that, because of the enemy of the ticking clock. So we're on set, we've got this much to do today, I can't go extra days, I can't go extra time. So some of the depth that I wish I had the time to explore with certain actors, sometimes I feel is truncated. Do you ever have that happen?
Oh, yeah. No, absolutely. And what can I say? Yes, but we have to persevere, we have to continue on, and sometimes do editing on the spot, right? I've on more than one occasion, I've held my script in my one hand. I've looked at the clock. I know what's left to do for the day, to make the day. Okay.
Right.
And no one's the wiser, frankly, if it goes well. You know
Yeah,
what I
well,
mean, right?
you're bleeding from these wounds. I am bleeding every time I cut coverage or angles or have to make those adaptations. But it is a function of the reality of I mean, probably both of us, we're making films within confined budgets now, and we're making films in multiple. You and I have both shot in 30 countries, so we've had these beautiful backdrops. But neither of us, I haven't. I'm assuming you haven't had the $100 million, or even the $50 million, the kind of budgets where we are on budgets where. That's and listen, I'm not complaining. It's part of the challenge and part of the fun. They say poetry exists because of the lines, So we have the lines of these budgets. We have a crew for a certain number of days, a location for a certain number of days, all these things. And actors who are in the moment, creating emotion, and as you were just talking about, transcendent truth. And sometimes that truth happens. Okay, do it again. Okay, do it. Bang, 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 bang. And then we move on. And in the movie itself, it slows down and it has power. But in the actual moment of filming, sometimes it kind of feels like we're making sausages to me. Have you ever had that feeling?
Sure. I read this somewhere. For me, it's a great analogy that a tapestry, when you look at a tapestry from the front, it's all very beautifully laid out and appears seamless. But when you turn it over, you see this jumble of thread, right? And we don't really want to show the audience the sausage making part that you referred to, apart from, I guess, the behind the scenes, if they want to peek in there.
Well, and we work. I mean, right now it's this timing. So we're filming this today on the 28th of April, 2020. So this is the middle of the world of quarantine and the world of COVID-19. So life has been completely sort of halted. I happen to have been filming in January, February in Romania, and I've shot 3/4 of my movie. Literally today was the day I was supposed to get on the plane and return for the final 2.5 weeks. Obviously right now we don't know when that's going to happen. But the good thing for me personally is that I'm editing. I'm an editor. And so I've had all of these weeks in essentially a quiet office with nobody here to try to create that seamless tapestry from all these pieces and parts and bits and bytes, right? Because this is that time where if it still feels like the threads are showing, then we're not happy. We have to force it into this seamlessness. I love that word. That's the transitions, and that's the dialogue, and that's the pacing, and it's to create a seamlessness. We're talking about actors, but the actors' performances, that is really the bedrock of what we're putting on the screen.
Yeah. I kind of feel at the end of the day, we're all like children. You and I who make the film, the actors in the film, the people watching the film in the audience, we're all like children. And when a child is truly engaged, they forget about everything else around them, and you're just communicating, it's just heart to heart. And I think that's what we all want to see happen with our work. We want to make films that have, that succeed in doing that.
I'm speaking with Cristobal Krusen, writer and director. And, Cristobal, I was looking at your bio. You got some healthy, you got some Harvard time, some New York University time, some Art Center in Pasadena time. That's a pretty impressive educational background you've put together.
Yeah, I guess. As the Apostle Paul said, I wouldn't put it this strongly, but you know what he said about his background, right? He considered it all rubbish or dung compared to the surpassing greatness of knowing Christ. As I said, I became a follower of Jesus at the age of 29.
That's statistically pretty rare, isn't it?
I believe so. For the 3 or 4 years prior to that, I was searching. I was looking for meaning and purpose. I was looking for the truth. I actually phrase it as such. If anybody were to have asked me during those years, my mid-20s, what are you up to, Chris? Well, I'm on a search for the truth. I mean, I would have actually said that,
Wow.
And I was looking in all the religions of the world. I studied Buddhism, Hinduism, Islam, Christian Science, Baha'i faith. I even studied occultic things, all in a search for the truth. And the last holy book that I opened up was the Bible. It was at the end of the line for me. And when I read the Sermon on the Mount, I was transfixed. I was overtaken, overwhelmed. And that did it for me. Reading the words of just the words of Jesus in the Bible. I wasn't in a church. I was reading the Bible.
The blessed R's, man. It's a beautiful thing to think that there is a standard in the universe that recognizes what the blessed are. There is an objective truth. So it's blessed to do the right things and to be the givers. If there were no God, that would be absurd concept, wouldn't it? There would be no basis for that.
Mm-hmm. I hadn't thought about that. That's a great insight.
I want to talk about some of your films. And, again, that bit of many fragmented pieces, I guess there's more fragmented pieces even than just what you're doing in the edit room, because it starts with the writing. Mm-hmm. So tell me about your process as a writer.
Sure.
What do you do?
Yeah. Well, for me, it always, before I write anything, it's an idea that comes into my, I'll say it again, my heart, my mind, my heart, somewhere in there, somewhere in that invisible to the naked eye region, an idea comes. And the idea could be as simple as an image. The idea could have some tie to a historical event. The idea could come from reading a book or an article. But wherever that idea comes from, it begins to percolate, I read this interesting quote from J.J. Abrams just a few days ago. He said, I'll paraphrase him, ideas are always coming at me and I'm always just pushing them away. But the ones that I can't get out of my mind are the ones that end up being the ones that I pursue. And I relate to that because, we're bombarded with potential ideas. I'm sure you get people writing you, John, God has spoken to me and he wants you to make my movie. And here's the storyline, and it just never grabs you, right? And you probably get a lot of those kinds of emails that come in, people who are convinced that you should make their movie and have you thought of this, done this or that or whatever. So my process is, once I have the idea that won't let me go and that I don't want to let go, I have to discipline myself enough to start putting words to paper. And I start out, again, from a discipline process of trying to put the idea of the movie down on paper in a treatment form. Not the screenplay, but a treatment, a scene-by-scene treatment, which is but for the sake of your listeners, is a kind of scene-by-scene description of what the movie is going to look like.
About how many pages would you make that, Cristobal? 12, 15 pages, something like that? Or what's yours?
Exactly. 15, at the most 20, single space, not double space, but single space. And it's just sort of, if I were telling you without a lot of emotion, what's happening in the story, it would just tell you what's going on in the story. And I try to spend a lot of time on the treatment to identify problem areas, weaknesses. So I spend time on the treatment. And then at some point I say, okay, it's time to start writing the screenplay. And I personally use Movie Magic Screenwriter. I do have Final Draft as well. But I started out with Movie Magic, and I'm an old guy, so it's hard to change. But they're pretty much the same anyway. And I just start writing the screenplay. And on the movie that I'm currently engaged in now, working on now, I
Is
remember
that the Puzzle Factory, by the way?
The Puzzle Factory.
Okay,
yeah.
good.
I did not write the treatment. No, sorry, I did write the treatment. But when I started to write the first draft, I thought, oh, this is going to just come together. And I got to page 40, and normally a screenplay is 100 pages, maybe 110 or 20. I got to page 40, and it just came to a crashing halt. And I couldn't figure out what happened. What happened? The idea was very clear. It was all there. And what happened? And for months, I couldn't figure it out. I like to walk every day. And one day on my daily walk, it just dropped. I figured out what was missing and went back and, believe it or not, wrote the next 60 pages. So the process can be very mysterious, arcane. It can be counterintuitive, all of those things. You just have to keep at it. A rule of thumb that I employ is if you can, on average, write 3 pages a day of your screenplay, that's pretty good. Just make that your goal. And once you have your treatment, the skeleton, you know where you're heading and so forth and so on, just go for it. Try to get 3 pages a day, and guess what? You'll have a finished first draft, and do the math, a month and a half or 2 months.
And there you just said the magic words, first draft. So what's harder for you, writing or rewriting?
Oh, I don't know. I started out wanting to be a writer before I wanted to be a filmmaker. So I couldn't answer that question, to be totally honest.
Maybe harder is the wrong word. What takes more time, getting the first draft done or getting it to your actual shooting script?
Okay. Probably the first draft. Having said that, if I have the luxury of time, I'd love to be able to let something simmer and brew. We're in planting season, springtime here. You don't just throw a seed in the ground and wake up. A little kid might come to the window to see if the tree has come up, right? But that doesn't work that way. It takes time. And so I love, if I have the luxury to be able to take time with something, I really, really like that. Because when you rush things, you miss things. So
it's fun when you're writing. I've had days where my wife will walk into my office and I'm laughing. I'm cracking myself up because my characters are funny and they're making me laugh. And it's like there comes a point where you're just sort of catching the story and just recording what they're saying rather than having to sort of forge it from the fires of your soul. And then I started giggling and like, listen to this. Listen to what they said. They're being funny today.
Right.
It's an amazing process. But the script is such obvious. This goes without saying, but it's the foundation of everything that's going to happen from then on. But there's a million things going to happen from then on. And you list yourself on some of your films as producer, and other films you've worked with other producers, Gary Wheeler and others. When you're the producer as well as the writer and the director, that's a lot of hats to wear. How do you do all that?
You just do your best. It's you go on overdrive. I'm giving a lot of quotes today, but the Mexican director Iñárritu,
amazing director. Alejandro.
He said, to make a film is easy. To make a good film is war. And then to make a great film is a miracle. So on the Puzzle Factory, I've also been acting. And it wasn't my first choice to act, but I relented when people on our team was saying, you really should be the one to play this part because it's based on part of my own life. And anyway, I decided to accept the challenge, and I've been playing that part. Yeah. And I have to admit, I really do enjoy it because if I'm completely honest with you, I may be more an actor than anything else.
Wonderful.
I don't know. I mean, when I was in high school, I was acting in all the high school plays, and thought I'd be an actor. I even acted in a play at Harvard, but it just didn't stick. And I think I felt I owed something to my parents to not become an actor, that would be too far on the other side. So I don't know, I didn't pursue it, but it's been in me and in there. And so most recently I was in Mexico in March shooting scenes for the Puzzle Factory, where I was directing. Of course, I had been the writer. I was producing. I was working with a Mexican producer as well. And I was acting. And sometimes I was driving the production van and running to the restaurant to get a plate of food to put it. I mean, it was kind of chaotic in ways, but you just do what you got to do. Like, Omaha Beach,
It sounds funny because I think it's a great privilege that both of us would say it's an amazing privilege to have the opportunity to direct a film of your own writing. Not everybody gets that chance. Mm-hmm. And I pinch myself almost every day. Sometimes I'll have my script supervisor, literally, would you just pinch me? I want to make sure I'm not dreaming. But at the same time, I don't want to deny the fact that it can be ferociously taxing.
Yes.
It takes every brain cell, every ounce of strength. You've got to stay healthy. And now to add acting on top of that, now you've got that other piece to be thinking of. Does Cristóbal, the director, ever pull Cristóbal, the actor, and say, you're pushing it a little too hard in this scene? Or who gives you the feedback you might need?
Well, you need good people around you, right? And you need friends who can talk truth to you without you getting all upset and alarmed and everything.
Right.
So I'll give a shout out to Patricio Corona, Pato Corona in Mexico, who's edited a couple of my films. And he said, and he was there in Mexico with me as kind of a co-director, second unit director. And especially when I was acting, he would give me a little word. Now remember, Cristóbal, he would just be blunt and say, don't overdo it.
Right, there you go.
And, it's... So I really appreciate that. So it's good to have friends.
As an actor or as a musician too, and I do this music world, there is this is a fine line between just blatant insecurity, pride, and then I call something else. There is actually a healthy need for honest feedback. When you pour yourself out there in a scene, or even as I come off of a music set, I really, really want to hear. And it's okay if it's brutally honest and negative. Like, I noticed you forgot the lyrics, or you might have tried hitting the pitch or whatever. But I think as an actor, you recognize, boy, you would like to have the director come to you after you did nail it and say, dude, you nailed it.
Yes.
And
can I sorry.
No, go.
Just to jump in there, I like to take on acting gigs, acting jobs, for the reason that by being on that other side of the camera, and I don't tell if it's a local commercial shoot or something. I don't tell the director that I'm also a director. They don't know that. I don't want them to know that. Mm-hmm. I want to give them my best as an actor, and I also want to observe them as a director, but from the perspective of an actor, so that I will understand better how to treat an actor, how to communicate with an actor, to your point.
I think that's super, super wise. I mean, the point of the conductor of the orchestra is that the conductor has played all the instruments. They stand there and don't play any of them, but if they needed to, I like to think they could sit in and grab the cello, and they understand the needs of the cellist, and they understand the needs of the French horn player. The director ought to understand, in my opinion, maybe you disagree with this, but ought to understand what the cameraman and the camera department is trying to do,
of course,
and what the audio department needs, and all the different roles. And the longer we've been in this business, there's one thing about getting older that's good. We've made more mistakes than the younger people have, and it's really helpful to have made a lot of mistakes in order to hopefully avoid them. So to be an actor and a director, I think that's particularly wise, and particularly I would imagine your actors sense that touch in you that knows what they're going through to try to deliver that performance in that small little space and time with which they have to do it.
Yeah, I hope so. I hope so. Again, I love actors. I just love actors, and so my whole approach to them is to be very gentle and intimate. Like I'm in this with you. We're in this together. I'm not talking down to you. You're not over there and I'm here. We're in this together.
That's a great point. It's a really, really great point. And we've all heard these different quotes. I saw on one of your lines that you says directing is 50% casting. I've always said it's 90% casting.
Yeah, I pick a number. Pick a number. You could be right. You could be right. Yeah.
But I know that casting process, and we work hard at that, and casting directors work very hard at that, and they are invisible people in the film. But if they don't introduce you to the right people with the right instincts and the right combinations of people, you'll struggle. And so part of the way of casting is to have that authentic respect for what they're bringing. It's a difficult job. You don't know when you're going to work, when you're going to not work, and I respect I hate, all these people come and audition and most of them get rejected. And I'm soft. I hate the rejection part of it. And I like many, many, many of them, but you can only put one person in at quarterback and you can only put one person in at left tackle or,
Sure.
And so that breaks my heart sometimes because I recognize, boy, they all would make a different film. But you have to decide which combination of human beings is going to kind of create that film that you think will be the most powerful.
I couldn't agree with you more. And you used that word instincts. I think that's a wonderful word for us as filmmakers to keep in the forefront of our thinking. Trust your intuition. Trust your instincts. And trust the instincts of the actor. Look, you can always say, you know what, I don't think it'll work. But let them bring something to the table that you never, ever thought of, ever. And be surprised.
What about ad-libbing?
And the DP, as well.
Well,
Sorry?
right. What? So, okay, let's stick with that point. You're working with a crew and some department heads, and each of them have something to offer. And I have found, boy, you're smart. If you've hired good DPs, if you've hired good actors, that the wisest thing you can do is see what they bring to the table. At the same time, you're on the clock. So you've got to make that call in the moment. The DP has another idea for how to film the scene. And it might even be better than your idea, but it's 4:15 and it's going to be dark at 5. And same with the actors. Sometimes I'm like, there's ad-libbing, which has been some of the best lines ever. And then there's the comedic. Can you just maybe go ahead and read the lines on this one? Have you found that ever?
Oh, sure. and it's I have a friend, producer, Hollywood producer, said to me, producing is about managing expectations. And so if you're looking at your clock and you realize how much time is left and the DP wants to do this amazing shot, with love and respect, you have to tell them, hey, we just can't do it. Same with the actor. And the buck does have to stop somewhere. And that's also part of being a director.
Your instincts seem to take you to stories to be shot in foreign countries. And I haven't seen all your films, but Sabina K was shot in Bosnia-Herzegovina, is that right? And The Final Solution in South Africa.
All right.
And you just mentioned the one you're working on right now, The Puzzle Factory. You're shooting that in Mexico?
Well, part of it. Most of it is in the United States, but 10-15% is in Mexico.
Do you have an attraction to shooting foreign countries, or what's your thought about that?
Yeah, I do. I'm not a real techie kind of guy, and I admire those people who are. It's just that I'm not wired that way so much. So the virtual creation of, say, Baghdad in a green screen and everybody walking around in a kind of virtual world, like the Marvel heroes, and I just don't take to that very well. I'm not criticizing it. I just don't take to it. On the other hand, being in an authentic location in another country is, for me, I'm like a kid in a candy store. Mm-hmm. When I look at, not so much nowadays, but in years past, I think a lot of Hollywood movies tried to, and maybe still today, I don't know, but try to fake a foreign location, but it looks like L.A.
Yeah,
or
it does.
Yeah, or the old TV show Combat. They're fighting the Germans in Europe, and you can tell they're in Southern California on these hills with no trees. I mean, it doesn't look like Europe, Right. And so I speak Spanish fluently. I've lived in Mexico altogether about 4 years. I've lived in Australia on 2 different occasions. I've traveled through Europe. I guess I'm kind of I might just be the most interesting man
I think you are, absolutely.
But there's something about an authentic location that just kind of sweeps me away. I love that. I love going for the authenticity. And why try to recreate a foreign place in the United States if you can go to that place and shoot there in the language? I also love language. I love language. I love hearing. It's hard for me to watch a foreign film dubbed into English. Yeah. It just makes my skin crawl, because you're missing the dynamics of the real voice of the actor, and I love that. To me, it's almost like music, hearing the sound of the language. So I go for all of that too.
There are so many little nuances, and it can be interiors and exteriors. I mean, the light switches are a little bit different, and the molding on the flooring is a little bit different. And I agree with you. And I think as a filmmaker, I personally always am. I'm sort of drawn to when the film takes me around the world. I find that sort of visually interesting. And to stay domestic, you've got to overcome a barrier of sameness. It certainly can be done, but if you're just going to be shooting in my neighborhood, well, that's not going to interest me. So you better really up the performances or the plot. But if you're all of a sudden taking me someplace that's visually interesting, you've got one more hook into me a little bit, and I do like that a lot. And language too. Do you work with so in another country? Do you have those actors speak English with their local accent, or do you have them speak their local language and then you subtitle?
Local language is what I do. So, so I speak Spanish, so that's no problem. I speak some French, and that's helped me. I've actually been able to, communicate in French with actors. But I don't speak any Bosnian, for example, and. But I wanted Sabina K to be in Bosnian. And I'm glad we made that decision to go with the native language. Obviously, there was a translator. My first AD was the main translator. She had to do that as well as her other duties as a first AD. But it worked. And a number of the actors spoke enough English where we could communicate in English.
Mm-hmm. Well, I've been doing that as well, and there are scenes where I really don't know for sure if they're saying the lines or they're saying something different because I don't speak Romanian, and sometimes, I find out later that maybe those lines were adjusted, but I also found that it's not hard at all to tell whether you like the performance. It's not the words. You know for sure whether you like the performance, and I have no trouble going and saying, boy, that's been interesting for me to discover.
I totally agree with you, and I've had the same experience. And I think that points to that universality that we share as human beings,
Yeah.
Heart to heart.
It's surprising. Now, I will say, I'm digressing a bit, but I have, I've been experimenting with these sort of blended films where I agree with you that I like to hear the native language, whether it's Hebrew if I'm doing a film in Israel, or whether it's Bosnian as you did, or I'm working in Romanian. And at the same time, I'm a little bit hesitant for my whole movie to be subtitled, not because there's anything wrong with subtitling, but simply because if I'm reading the subtitles, I'm not looking at the picture. And so it forces me to write quite differently. Subtitles don't lend themselves to long, eloquent speeches. You've got to keep your words and your phraseology short and specific. So anyway, I've been playing around with this blend where sometimes it's in the native language, and then for some reason, and I make up some excuse where they might speak English at home, or they might. So anyway, whether that's the good choice or the bad choice, I don't know. But I do think it's been an interesting thing to say, here's the one thing, is when they are speaking English, at least their accent is really authentic. So the same way you said, hey, I can tell that that's Southern California trying to pose as Germany, you can also tell that that's an English-speaking actor usually putting on a Russian accent. And sometimes it's almost, no matter how good of a job they do, it almost makes you laugh because you actually know that Nicolas Cage doesn't really speak Russian or whatever.
Right.
So when we're working with an actor in their native language, even if they're speaking English, what I like about it is that the accent is, of course, exactly right.
Yeah. But could I ask, why would they be speaking English in that context?
Well, you have to have, as with everything, you have to have some justification for this. So there are scenes where there's no reason they would possibly speak English, and so therefore I just don't have them doing it. But in the case of the project I'm working on now, Richard Wurmbrand spoke 14 languages. So he was multilingual. He could speak Russian, he could speak German, he could speak English. So because I'm making a film that I was going to primarily speak in English, when he was at home, or when he was speaking privately, we had them speaking English. But if he was speaking publicly or speaking so I am admitting I'm doing a little bit of creative gymnastics with this, and I'm still experimenting with asking audiences, did you like that? What I found after Tortured for Christ is I said, what did you think of the language? And people said, well, what was it? I don't remember. They didn't notice that we switched back and forth between subtitles and language. It's an interesting thing.
I by the way, I think you pulled that off very nicely. I saw Tortured for Christ.
Oh,
Beautiful
did you?
film.
Thank you.
I really liked that. I love the film. I thought you did an excellent job, and I think it did work well. The language part of it. It didn't throw me out of the movie.
Well, I really appreciate that. And these are the sort of practical things that sometimes we have to deal with. Authentically, the film should always be in the native language. For our market, sometimes we make whatever sacrifices. And blending that, again, that's the fun job of the director. We get to make those calls and hopefully learn from our mistakes and hopefully take those long walks where the best inspiration falls onto our heads, or those long showers where these things come together. So let me just say let you wrap up with this new project you're working on. You want to give us any teasers about this or ideas of when it might be available or anything like that?
Well, we hope to, and not because of COVID-19, we had always planned to not be filming right now, but we hope to pick up filming again in late August or early September. To be perfectly frank with you, the reason, and I was shooting in March, which we just finished last month, but we had planned to take off these 4 or 5 months to raise more money to continue with the filming process well before COVID-19 came along. So we're hopeful that we can succeed in doing that and pick up the filming again in September. And then our goal is to complete all of the post-production and release the film early 2021, perhaps as early as January, more realistically February or March of next year. So the story... I'll just tell you real quickly the story. The story is the Puzzle Factory itself. The title comes from a slang expression for the mental hospital, the insane asylum. It's a slang expression. And my firstborn child, his name is Daniel, developed schizophrenia as a teenager and had to eventually be institutionalized with, severe schizophrenia. And so caring for Daniel and sharing in his struggles And, well, you can imagine many difficult days and months and years, frankly. All of that has sort of pounded like when we tenderize meat. I think they take something to pound the meat to make it more tender. Those experiences have tenderized me to issues related to mental health. And as much as my son has suffered and still does suffer, I have really wanted to be able to redeem those sufferings and to show honor to my son for all that he's been through, and to offer hope to the millions, because we know statistically there are tens of millions of people who are affected very, very seriously so by mental illness, whether they're suffering from mental illness or have a loved one suffering from mental illness. And so I want to, and it can be such a dark place, and the church is often behind the times or not even in the picture. There has been such a stigma surrounding mental illness that nobody kind of wants to go there. But we know that Jesus is everywhere, and offering love and forgiveness and hope. So, yeah. So the movie, more than anything else, wants to give people hope, because there is hope. That's what I've learned. What I've learned in my life is that as difficult and tragic as certain circumstances have been, Jesus gives us hope, and the gospel is hope. We have the hope of the resurrection. That's at the core of our faith as Christians. So listen, there's much reason for hope, my friends. Do not despair. So that's what the movie, it explores my son's life, the father's life. It's often imaginary. It's not necessarily totally based in reality. It's a narrative film, feature length. And at the end of the day, we hope to really offer people hope.
And if someone happens to be listening to our podcast and says, "Man, I love that idea. How can I help you make that budget? How can they support the film?" Where would they go?
messengerfilms.com or puzzlefactorymovie.com. And it won't be too difficult.
Well, at messengerfilms.com, or was it Puzzle Factory?
Puzzlefactorymovie.com.
Puzzlefactorymovie.com. Yeah. We don't make these films if somebody doesn't help us with the finances of them. And I pray, Cristóbal, that your financing comes through, that doesn't impede the message and the power and the impact of this film you're making. Cristobal Krusen, a great filmmaker, a deep thinker, an artist, that you should watch his films. You should watch Final Solution and Undaunted and Sabina K and hopefully The Puzzle Factory next year. Thank you for sharing this time with me. I appreciate you being on the show today, and we'll hopefully run into each other in the future someplace.
Amen. Thank you, John.
All right, man.
Okay.
God bless.
Have no shame, no, we are not afraid, no shame of the gospel of his name. It's the power of God by which we all are saved. We need not be afraid.
No Shame is a weekly podcast where John Grooters discusses life at the intersection of faith and culture with all kinds of interesting and inspiring guests. Subscribe to the podcast today by going to johngrooters.com, select the podcast tab, and hit subscribe. Listen whenever you have time, but don't miss any of these life-giving conversations.